Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Lauren Reese, and it's my privilege to welcome you to today's event on solar geoengineering research and governance. For those of you joining a Wilson Center event for the first time, a special welcome and a quick word about where you're tuning into. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to President Wilson. We were mandated by Congress to connect policy, practice, and research through nonpartisan, independent analysis and open dialogue. Our program's expertise span every region of the world and today's most pressing issues. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, connects issues at the intersection of environment, health, and security to foreign policy and development. We're pleased to have the Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program co-sponsoring today's event as well. The topic of solar geoengineering is one that evokes strong reactions. Proponents argue that solar geoengineering is an essential tool for addressing an urgent climate crisis. Detractors argue that this Plan B framing gives carbon polluters a workaround to delay the transition to a world powered by renewable energy. It is a complicated topic that warrants thoughtful and evidence-based discussion, driven not by a desire to come to a particular conclusion, but to unpack the complexity of the topic in a way that allows us to move the conversation forward responsibly. Today's panel aims to do that by sharing insights from the recent National Academy of Sciences report on solar geoengineering research and placing them in the broader context in which the report was launched. I want to thank the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment and the Union of Concerned Scientists for their collaboration and co-sponsorship of this event. The Wilson Center strives to be a safe place for complicated conversations, and our ability to be that space has so much to do with the brilliance of our partners. It also has everything to do with the efforts of my colleagues behind the scenes, including my colleagues in ECSP, Amanda King, Ratia Tekanet, Ruth Greenspan-Bell, and Wilson Center scholar Beth Jalecki, who you'll be hearing from today, as well as our audio-visual team, without whom the Wilson Center would be unmoored. With that, I'm pleased to hand the floor over to Simon Nicholson, who will be facilitating today's discussion. Simon is Associate Professor of International Relations at American University and co-founder of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment and the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. He's also a recent contributor to the Wilson Center and Adelphi's 21st Century Diplomacy Project on the topic of solar radiation management. All of those are a mouthful. Thank you, Simon. Over to you.
A mouthful indeed, Lauren. Thank you. And thank you to all of your colleagues at the Environmental Change and Security Program for conceiving of this event and for pulling us together today. So again, solar radiation management, solar geoengineering is the subject matter today. The basic idea behind solar geoengineering is that one way to respond to climate change or a potential component of climate change response might be to artificially reflect some amount of incoming solar energy back into space. This could have a cooling effect on the planet. As Lauren intimated, some folks see this as a potentially important and useful tool as a way to offset climate risk, as a way to protect vulnerable populations, as a way to buy time for other forms of response to take hold. But there's also lots of contention in the subject matter. And by talking about this new National Academy of Sciences report titled Reflecting Sunlight, we have an opportunity to dig into some of the subject matter. We'll talk about solar radiation management in broad terms with our panelists today, and also try and place solar radiation management in the context of US domestic climate change response and also international efforts to respond to climate change. Let me introduce our panelists quickly. In alphabetical order, Beth Jalecki is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Peter Frumhoff is the Director of Science and Policy and the Chief Climate Scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And joining from Delhi, India is Ambush Sagar. He's the Vipulda and Mahesh Chaturvedi Professor of Policy Studies and founding head of the School of Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Technology. The format will be a brief presentation from Peter. Peter and Ambush were two of the panelists who put together this new National Academy of Sciences report. A brief presentation from Peter on the report, followed by remarks from Beth and Ambush, and then an open conversation. I'll be asking questions about why are we even talking about this now? What are the concrete recommendations coming out of this report? How do we think about the role of the United States in a potential research agenda around solar radiation management and the governance efforts that need to take place? What roles for international cooperation? And things like that. So if you have additional questions that you'd like me to introduce into the conversation, please send them through at any point and we'll try to get to your question through the conversation. To submit your questions, you should write to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. In your email, please indicate your name, your title, and affiliation, along with your submitted question. That email address, ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, is also listed on the web page through which you're viewing this event. Okay, that's it by way of introductions. Over to you, Peter.
Great. Well, thank you, Simon, and thank you very much to the Wilson Center for organizing this event. It's timely, it's important to have this conversation. Let me just take a moment to pull up my slides. I hope you all can see this. I'm going to give an overview of the report with a principal focus on the governance dimensions of the report. In the time I have, I won't go into detail with all aspects of it. I do want to let folks know, if you haven't noticed already, there should be a link to the full National Academy's report on the website through which you're engaging in this conversation. We can make sure that you have it if you don't already, where you can go for more information. So let's start. Why a National Academy's report on solar geoengineering research and its governance, and why now? Let me just get this into slideshow mode. See if I can do that. Oops, 1 second. Bear with me. Great. So you all know this. Climate change is not a feature of the past, or a feature of the future. It's happening now. We're experiencing it now. 2020 was the second warmest year on record. We're seeing impacts of climate change from exacerbated wildfires, from tropical hurricanes, cyclones that are increasing in impact and severity through rising ocean temperatures and rising seas, impacts on human communities, not only from the extreme events we're seeing, but from melting glacier ice. We saw back in February the breaking of a glacial dam in the Himalayas with tremendous impacts on northern India. Climate change is happening now. It's happening across the globe. It's having real impacts in real time. Next slide. I'm going to need someone. I think I don't have ownership of the slide share, so if the slide can be advanced, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much. So in addition to the impacts that we're seeing, progress in responding to climate change has been, needless to say, exceptionally slow. We are far from the emissions reductions commitments that we need to align with the Paris Agreement goal of keeping global average temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are already at 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We've just seen in the latest round of increased commitments, nationally determined contributions to reduce emissions, including importantly from the Biden administration, an increased effort to meet the gap, to close the gap between where we are today and where we need to be with respect to aligning with a carbon budget consistent with a 1.5 degree target. But we still have a very long way to go. We need to live into those commitments. We need to accelerate them. But clearly there are significant gaps between where we are and where we need to be. And it's in that context that both attention to and debate over the questions about solar geoengineering research and its potential future deployment are growing. We're having conversations about it often in the media, and in particular triggered by proposed outdoor experiments that draw attention to the question of whether and under what conditions we should be doing research on solar geoengineering. So what do we mean by solar geoengineering? There are various proposals that have been put forward to moderate warming by either increasing the amount of sunlight that is reflected back to space, or by reducing the trapping of outgoing thermal radiation. And the principal approaches that have been put forward, none of which have been actually developed in any meaningful way, but have been considered in the research literature. One is what's called stratospheric aerosol injection, which essentially, which essentially mimics volcanoes by putting stratospheric aerosol particles into the atmosphere, into the stratosphere, and increasing the reflectivity back into space. Marine cloud brightening is another reflecting sunlight approach that proposes to potentially increase the scattering, the reflection of marine clouds by putting aerosols into those clouds, sea salt in particular, and to increase their reflectivity and brightness. And then the third kind of prominent category of potential approaches is what's called cirrus cloud thinning, that is to thin cirrus clouds through a variety of mechanisms and allow more thermal energy to escape back into space. It's these three approaches that were considered in the National Academy's report that Ambuj and I, with several other colleagues, put together and released just back in March. That report builds on several previous National Academy studies, including principally a report back in 2015 that laid the groundwork by looking at the potential research opportunities and priorities to further understand solar geoengineering, or sometimes called climate intervention approaches to reflect sunlight, but which did not get into the particulars of what a research program should look like and how that program should be governed. And that was the charge to the committee developing the report that was just released last month. So what was the charge to the study committee? It was to develop a transdisciplinary research agenda for solar geoengineering, to consider the potential impacts, both positive and negative, of solar geoengineering on the atmosphere, on climate system, on natural and managed ecosystems, and on human systems and societies, and the technological feasibility of these interventions, to explore and recommend appropriate governance mechanisms for solar geoengineering research, and importantly, to address research needs, research priorities in tandem with governance, such that understanding what research is needed and how that research could be governed were developed together, and one approach could inform the other. The committee that was put together to assess solar geoengineering research and governance was chaired by Chris Field of Stanford University. It was a really diverse committee by both expertise and geography, background and perspective, including ecologists, atmospheric scientists, atmospheric chemists, legal scholars, policy experts, ethicists, social scientists, very broad range of expertise to inform our understanding of this issue. The study, importantly, was not funded by Congress, which is often the case for National Academy reports, but rather by primarily by several philanthropies, in part by several federal agencies, and significantly also by the National Academy's own internal funding. So I want to just share with you some top line conclusions from the report. One, which we'll say again repeatedly, is solar geoengineering is not under any means a substitute for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't address the root cause of the climate problem. It doesn't address some of the impacts of rising emissions, including ocean acidification. It carries with it significant risks and uncertainties, both environmental, social, geopolitical. But that, given the urgent and growing risks of climate change, it's important, the committee found, to understand better the risks, feasibility, and potential of solar geoengineering as a potential additional contribution to the portfolio of climate responses. We really started from a finding that the current state of understanding of solar geoengineering in the literature is really not sufficient to support informed decisions. That research literature is ad hoc, it's fragmented, it's not well established. There are many questions that are not sufficiently addressed. And it's in that context that we recommend that the United States, and this is important, in coordination with other nations, should develop a transdisciplinary solar geoengineering research program that it should be coordinated under the umbrella of the US Global Change Research Program, which sits within the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and is an interagency coordinating body for global change research. And that program should develop policy relevant information and findings rather than advancing a path to deployment. We can come back to talk about that distinction. And finally, to reinforce this point, that solar geoengineering research should operate under robust research governance. Let me unpack this just a little bit. So with respect to integrated transdisciplinary research agenda, we often think about federal research on climate topics as being primarily in this lower green box or oval about impacts and technical dimensions. And clearly these are really important. There are many questions about atmospheric chemistry and microphysics, about the climate system's response to potential climate solar geoengineering interventions, about the ecological and social impacts of those interventions, and so on, that really need to be furthered and more deeply understood. But that's just one component of an integrated and transdisciplinary research agenda as we sought to define it. We clearly need to understand and put research into understanding what it means to build capacity, not just within the United States, but globally, to develop an informed research community, to look at the future conditions under which solar geoengineering might potentially be deployed, both climatological conditions, social, ecological conditions, geopolitical conditions. How do we think about that in the context of informing how climate models, how solar geoengineering models might project potential impacts should it ever be deployed? And just as importantly, to really build out and unpack the social dimensions and uncertainties about solar geoengineering, including how do we meaningfully engage the public at a variety of levels in both the design and development and understanding of the research, and how do we dig into the ethical dimensions of solar geoengineering, not just ethical questions that are here today with respect to the notion of who gets to decide, for example, what technologies might be used and under what conditions they might be deployed, but also to think about the intergenerational equity dimensions of this, because solar geoengineering would be deployed potentially for many decades and longer, having implications not just for today, but for generations that follow. There are significant research questions that require input from philosophy and ethics, as well as the social sciences and physical sciences that we typically think about as centered within a research agenda. So that's just a very top-line view of the approach to developing a research agenda that we put forward. We specified, as I noted earlier, that the US Global Change Research Program should be tasked with coordinating this body of research by, for example, developing a coordinating approach across work within federal agencies, by fostering transdisciplinary knowledge, by ensuring peer review, importantly, by prioritizing international coordination and co-development of research with other nations, by limiting research on technology with direct applicability to deployment to really early stage fundamental research, to taking very seriously the need to advance public engagement, not just within the United States, but internationally, and paths forward to engage the public in helping to inform and shape the research program. And to recognize that when we think about key stakeholders in the development of a research program with respect to technologies that would have global impacts, that it's really important to think about how best to engage stakeholders that would include climate vulnerable communities, underrepresented communities, including from indigenous populations and in the global South. But this cannot be a singularly US focused or Northern focused, Western focused enterprise. Let me take a few minutes to talk about some of the recommendations with respect to research governance. We highlighted that the program should operate under a robust research governance approach and eventually build out, work in coordination with other nations to develop an international set of governance mechanisms. We talked about a variety of approaches that need to be developed, including, I'll just name some of them here, a code of conduct, a permitting system for outdoor experiments, meaningful and effective approaches to engage the public and stakeholders, and several approaches to ensure that the work is being developed in coordination with other nations, both scientific communities within other nations, as well as science agencies and government entities. These are all essential in our view to support transparency, public engagement, data sharing, and international cooperation, that these are really core pillars of what a research governance approach should look like. We are currently lacking almost all of these in any meaningful way, and they'll need to be developed at the front end of an effective research program. Just to unpack a code of conduct a little bit, one of the things we called for was not just that researchers should adhere to a code of conduct, but funders of that research should mandate that researchers adhere to a code of conduct. Funders, including in this context, potentially Congress, should we decide to move forward with a federal funding program. A code of conduct that would protect the scientific quality of proposed research, that would avoid atmospheric experiments with detectable climate or other environmental impacts. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about this in a moment. To ensure that researchers make public the results of their research that provide for suitable levels of public and stakeholder and participation, and actively support equity in all of its, and inclusion in all of its dimensions in the development and conduct of solar geoengineering research. We made several recommendations about ensuring international cooperation and co-development of research, including giving priority to research efforts that include substantial international cooperation. And in some cases, particularly for large-scale long-term studies, requiring that such cooperation and co-development be a core condition for federal research support. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's often the case that outdoor experiments or proposed outdoor experiments raise great attention and concern, and rightly so, understandably so. They are sort of essentially kind of touchstones for visible touchstones for larger conversations over whether and how we should be doing this research at all. And so we wrestled with what kinds of criteria should there be in a federal funded research program for outdoor experimentation. And we concluded that experiments that involve releasing substances to the atmosphere should only be considered when they can provide critical observations that are either not already available or likely to become available through other approaches, laboratory studies, computer modeling, and what might be called experiments of opportunity, such as observing volcanic eruptions or ship tracks with respect to marine cloud brightening. That all outdoor experiments that involve the release of substances to the atmosphere be subject to robust governance, including a permitting system and impact assessments and meaningful public engagement. And we also quantified, I'll just give you kind of the top line view of this, the limits on those experiments with respect to their scale, both on an individual experiment and on an annual basis, calling for outdoor substance releases to be limited to a quantity of material that would be two orders of magnitude smaller than what could cause detectable changes in global mean climate or other adverse environmental effects. That is to ensure that we're setting constraints on outdoor experiments to the scale at which they are essentially quite small and not designed to have any adverse environmental impacts or climate impacts. let me talk a little bit about the guidance with respect to the recommendations with respect to a program budget for a federally funded research program. We wanted to make sure that the research would be modest, consistent with the relative priority of solar geoengineering to other topics in global change research, that it wouldn't shift the focus away from other priority approaches to researching global change, climate change and its impacts and solutions, and also be designed to limit the potential that would exacerbate concerns about what sometimes is called a slippery slope to deployment, that by funding research, we're essentially accelerating the buy-in and the support for ultimate deployment. Keep this initially at a modest scale, and by modest, but sufficient to cover the core issues. We proposed roughly a global change research, a solar geoengineering research budget on the order of $100 to $200 million a year over the first 5 years. That is $40 to $50 million a year, roughly, over a 5-year period. We thought that would be sufficient to equitably support all of the topics that we highlighted earlier, all of the clusters of research defined in the Academy's report. And again, to make sure that the funding for research is accompanied by sufficient funding for supportive implementation of both research governance and public engagement. So let me just close with a couple of top-line concluding remarks. Again, I probably can't say this enough. We concluded, and many others have as well, that solar geoengineering research really only makes sense in the context of a priority commitment to mitigation and adaptation. It cannot and does not stand alone as a priority in the absence of aggressive approaches to limit climate warming and to adapt to changes that are already locked in. But the recommendations that this committee is making are for an initial bounded exploratory phase of a global solar geoengineering research program, that we need to be open to a range of possible outcomes of an initial research phase, that it could indicate that solar geoengineering really shouldn't be considered any further, or potentially that it warrants further investigation and additional research. 5 years is definitely not enough to come to a conclusion about deployment. And then it's really important to think about coming to more deeply understanding both the technical dimensions of solar geoengineering, what's its technical feasibility with respect to our ability to actually deploy it and understand what the impacts would be, but also just as importantly, to more deeply understand the social feasibility of solar geoengineering. Would it be appropriate? Would it be acceptable? Could it be designed in a way that enhanced equity and inclusion or exacerbated those concerns? And we really need to understand the social dimensions of this as much as the technical dimensions of potential solar geoengineering deployment. And very importantly, that the recommendations on research and those on research governance need to be thought about and carried forward as an integrated whole. I would just offer that one of my concerns as we think about the report being taken up with respect to recommendations is that it's certainly possible that one could imagine federal agencies or Congress taking up the research recommendations, or those that they are most excited to take up, most aligned with their current mandates and priorities, and perhaps give lesser attention to the priorities that we put forward around ensuring robust and responsible governance. It's very important as a committee, and I think as a society, to make sure that the governance dimensions of research are taken as seriously as those about the design of the research itself. So with that, let me stop now and turn it back over to Simon.
Peter, thank you. I have plenty of questions, but I'll give you a little breather, at least for the moment. I should have mentioned at the outset that this is a 90-minute session, and so we have more than an hour left for conversation. Beth, let's turn to you. You're a current fellow at the Wilson Center. You've been thinking about solar geoengineering, solar radiation management for a good long time. I wonder what responses or reactions you have, or any further context you'd like to give us.
All right, thank you very much, Simon. It was an interesting report to read. So as I was going through it, there were 3 salient themes that I pulled out from reading each chapter. They kept coming up again and again. I'll start with exactly what Peter finished with. Studying solar radiation management does not mean giving up on decarbonization, either mitigation or carbon removal or both of these things. I hope that's true, but I fear that it will not turn out to be true. The mitigation cost of potentially trillions of dollars and the carbon removal timeline of decades both work against the hope that we can keep SRM in our back pocket until and unless we're desperate. This doesn't mean that states will give up decarbonization completely, but the drive to do it will slow down and lose urgency because the SRM option looks attractive by comparison. This then sets up a free rider problem with regard to greenhouse gas emissions cuts. The nation that does it first is the loser, paying the price and not reaping much benefit, and the nation that waits the longest is the winner, not paying much price and reaping all the benefit. The report points out in the summary that promising findings could increase pressure for deployment. This is a real concern, and it puts those working early in the field in a bind. The greater and more robust their research success, the more likely SRM becomes the go-to option rather than the fallback option. Now, some have asked, why is SRM the fallback option? Why not use it along with mitigation, adaptation, and carbon removal options? That's certainly what we should do. And the report points this out. But limited time, limited resources in the form of money and land, and limited political attention span to the problem don't give me much reason to think that our climate policies will go that way. SRM is quick and cheap relative to the other options, which makes successful governance of research that much more indispensable. The second theme I thought went through it was that successful governance of research and deployment will require greater integration across disciplines. Now, this one is key. Most of the research that I've seen is on the scientific side, which is appropriate for this stage of the technology. But we know that this is more than just a scientific problem. I believe Peter pointed out that it was ad hoc and fragmented. At this point, it still is. We need to pull it together under the aegis of governance. This problem quite literally encompasses all disciplines. Why do we want to ensure a stable climate? Why do we think justice for all people is important no matter where they live? Why do we think we should save nature and non-human lives as well as human lives? These questions are equally as important as what is the optimum radiant forcing at Arctic latitudes in the summer. Science can give us the what, social science gives us the how, and humanities gives us the why. All of these are critically important viewpoints when dealing with the potential that geoengineering provides. This means that if it is to go forward, and it seems like it is given that we're commissioning reports like this one, more people across all disciplines need to bring their brains to the conundrum of whether and how to change the planet. The third theme that I noticed running through the report was that of societal context, including political, economic, and security aspects, this being the key to public acceptance of solar geoengineering. This is where my own interest in the international relations and global security aspect of geoengineering come in. There was a short section on Chapter 3 and geopolitics. It could not have been more vague. But what particularly interested me in Chapter 6 was the mention of the Collingridge dilemma, that the best time to govern new technology is in its earliest stages. By the time it's clearly developed and operational, the socio-political assumptions about its use are locked into the decision-making process. And this is where national security comes into it. Existing national security and geopolitical concerns shape how we view the technology and how we make decisions about its use, not to mention who is we in this construct. We saw the same thing at work at the end of World War II and again during the space race. Conditions of substantial scientific and political uncertainty influence decision-making, and that's particularly true of national security decisions. Our government often makes such decisions based on an emergency or sense of threat, and as the effects of climate change continue to be felt with greater intensity, the more likely it is to reach for the emergency solution. As for generating public acceptance, this is the easiest place to apply the security frame. Tell people we have to apply solar geo in order to combat a national security threat, and they'll get behind it, particularly if they don't have to give up their cars or cheeseburgers. The problem I have with this frame is that it makes nature or the planet into the enemy, and that's morally and ethically problematic for a number of reasons. Finally, we have to keep in mind the time factor. None of these technologies are ready at scale right now, so any governance norms we build into the process in advance of experimentation and deployment have to be durable enough to hold up for the 21st century. Right now, we're behind a geoengineering version of John Rawls' veil of ignorance. We can see a little way into the future, but beyond that, 20, 30, 50 years from now, We have to consider what is the best possible solution we can put ourselves in, given the enormity of what we don't know. Reports like this one are where we start, but we can't stop there. But I will stop there.
Good, thank you. Ambush.
Thank you, and thanks very much for having me here. You know, it's a really important and, as one can see, a hot button topic, as already mentioned by pretty much every speaker. And therefore, I believe that the kind of discussions we are going to have now and discussions of this kind are on this topic are very timely and relevant. I'm just going to maybe add or re-emphasize some of the points that Peter made about the report, or what the report highlights. But before I do that, I want to just reiterate that I think everybody in the committee really realized that the SRM issue, the solar geoengineering issue, is a kind of a unique issue in terms of, as I said, it kind of polarizes opinions about whether we should do this or not. So the report was both shaped by and aims to respond to these characteristics of the SRM issue, and I'll talk about those in a second, and very clearly in the broader context of responses to meet the climate challenge. As Peter highlighted, SRM is characterized by deep scientific uncertainty. Solar geoengineering, sorry, is characterized by deep scientific uncertainty, both in terms of its ability to reduce greenhouse warming in a well-controlled and effective manner. I think there's great uncertainty about that. And also, if it is ever to be deployed, the possible impacts across geographies, societies, and ecosystems, right? But beyond just the technical side, you know, we don't have any clarity on how SRM research might be organized and governed, especially at the kind of timescales warranted, as Beth just mentioned, so as to ensure that with how the research itself is socially responsive and robust. Forget the deployment. And in fact, even an understanding of who the key stakeholders are and who might represent them. And eventually, if SRM is ever to be deployed, how it might be governed. You know, all these uncertainties, I think, are circulating around the solar geoengineering question. But, you know, it's one of these issues, at least as I see it, it's where you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. You know, engaging in solar geoengineering research raises questions of the kind, you know, moral hazard, slippery slope. Is it going to reduce attention from mitigation? Is it going to generate its own momentum so that it becomes unstoppable? But, you know, I guess my view at least is by not engaging in it, and I think this was the view of the committee eventually, by not engaging in it, we don't know whether it is actually socially and technically feasible option, or whether it actually indeed might be inherently ungovernable, as some analysts have complained. I want to just highlight a couple of points here now, given that context of the solar geoengineering issue and the characteristics of the field. Well, the report was produced in the US context. I think it certainly, as somebody who sits in India, it's very clear to me that this issue may be particularly pertinent for developing countries, because they are the ones who are most likely to suffer serious climate impacts. And it's concerned about these impacts, or these kind of impacts, that will be a major part of the rationale to consider deployment of solar geoengineering. And therefore, folks in developing countries must have a good understanding of the various dimensions of solar geoengineering, including the various uncertainties talked about, the efficacy and the potential impacts, the governability, and all of that. And then they naturally also must be part of any decision to consider deployment of solar geoengineering, in the unfortunate situation that such deployment has to be considered. And therefore, they must also understand the ramifications of deployment options. So while the report is really meant for a US audience, I think there are many lessons in here for an international audience. And we also obviously took cognizance of this, and we recognize that the solar geoengineering issue, and solar geoengineering research is therefore an inherently international issue. And therefore, the exploration of various dimensions of solar geoengineering must have an international component. Hence, the recommendation, as Peter mentioned, that the US should coordinate with other countries on its solar geoengineering research program. And I hope that this also will catalyze, serve to catalyze deeper engagement on this topic in the research communities of these countries. I want to mention the second point that, again, Beth had also highlighted, and Peter also highlighted, that I think this strong agreement that solar geoengineering research must be transdisciplinary and involve engagement of various stakeholders and publics. But the reality is we actually don't have clear models or consensus approaches for doing this effectively, either at the project level or at the program level. And therefore, I think it's important that the report not only proposed as an important theme, focusing on understanding public perceptions of solar geoengineering and strategies for inclusive and meaningful societal engagement, but also indicated that the research program design itself is a focus of reflection and inquiry with a desire to learn from our efforts so that we can do better as we proceed. And I think that's an important lesson, important takeaway message, which is that we really do need to think about how to design these kind of research programs such that they are true to these notions of transdisciplinarity and engagement of publics and stakeholders. The last issue near and dear to my heart is the issue of capacity. Capacity it's one of these issues. It's like equality and diversity. Most people are for it, but eventually there's little actual attention to paid to it, especially, or at least in relationship to what is really needed. The report does highlight the importance of capacity, but I'm happy that it does note the importance of capacity itself being an object of inquiry and unpacking various dimensions of the capacity issue. And I can talk about that later if we have time. And I should say the capacity question is not only about how to generate socially and technically robust knowledge, but also how to couple it to policymaking. The recent or ongoing COVID pandemic has shown that this capacity issue is not just an issue for developing countries, it also is an issue for developed countries. So in some senses, I think this report, to my mind, actually, I think puts out a bunch of really key points about if we were to engage on solar geoengineering research, how do we want to make sure that we engage in it in a thoughtful and reflective fashion, and therefore make sure that as we proceed on this bounded and limited research agenda, at least for the near future, how do we do it as well as possible? Thank you. I'll stop with that.
Ambush, thank you. Wow, okay, so where to start? Let me just remind everybody that if you have questions, you can send them via email to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. And the report that's being referenced through the remarks today can be found linked from the webpage through which you're viewing today's event. I guess my first question is why now? Why put this report out in this moment? And what was the intent behind the timing, if there was any? There are two dimensions to this, and Beth, I'll turn to you first. The first is a report like this brings legitimacy to a subject matter that some people think does not deserve legitimacy in this moment. I wonder what we can say about that, furthering comments that have already been made. But secondly, for Peter and Ambush, where do the recommendations of this report fit within a really crowded landscape for climate change action? Why are we saying that attention needs to be paid to this particular thing right now? Beth, do you want to start there?
Sure. Thanks, Simon. You're asking me if the delivery of this report legitimizes solar geoengineering in a way that it shouldn't. Is my understanding you correctly? In terms of
I wonder how you respond to that. I wonder how you respond to that concern which folks raise. Yeah. Yes,
I understand that concern. I have a lot of reservations about it myself, but I don't think the existence of a report like this is going to sway policy consideration of solar when we need it, if we need it. I think the whole idea behind this is research governance is sufficient. And I think it's necessary right now because we've seen how badly Paris is failing. We've seen that we're not meeting our targets. One of Peter's slides indicated the huge gap that we have to close in an extremely short period of time, not just in the United States, but all over the world, if we're to avoid catastrophic climate effects. So if we're considering all our options, solar geo being one of them, then anything that might help us close that gap could be legitimate. Whether or not you say, well, just even asking the question raises an untenable moral position, I don't agree. I think we do have to ask the question. What we need to be very careful of is jumping too fast to a particular conclusion. We need to not look at this in an emergency frame. We need to look at it in a frame of the 21st century. Here we are in 2021, so we have almost 80 years left in the century. How can we get out from behind this veil of ignorance? How can we position ourselves the best way we can for the rest of the century? All options are on the table, but we need to be very circumspect in how we address them.
Thanks, Beth. Peter, the why now question.
Well, there's no doubt that solar geoengineering as an option is not on the table. It should not be on the table today with respect to any consideration of deployment, and that the need to address the climate challenge today rests on the acceleration of ambition with respect to mitigation, primarily adaptation to unavoidable changes, scaling up of potential carbon removal strategies, as Beth alluded to, and the kind of longer term consideration of approaches that we may need to come back to over time as we look at further risks and identify what the challenges and what the gaps are in the decades ahead. So we are in a multi-decadal climate challenge. This is not something that's going to be addressed in the next couple of years in full. So our, to your point about why now, our priority focus has to be on mitigation and inconsistent with and building on and accelerating the ambition that in the US, at least the Biden administration has, I think, appropriately and ambitiously laid out as a starting point for action. Obviously, it needs to be an all hands on deck effort. Congress needs to be involved. But I think we can, to coin a phrase, walk and chew gum at the same time and understand that we need to invest a modest amount of research effort, not deployment effort, but research effort in deepening our ability to make informed decisions, both with respect to our knowledge about technical feasibility and social feasibility and robustness of governance on solar geoengineering on a longer term time frame. I don't know of anybody who is advocating for near-term deployment. And that's good. I think the moral hazard concerns are real. They're legitimate. We need to take account of them. I think all of the responses to the report that have been in the context of this overly legitimizes the potential for deployment are important concerns to take account of. And I think we all need to have our antenna out with respect to efforts that might be furthered by some who might wish to point to this as an alternative to or as a substitute for mitigation and adaptation. We're not seeing that today, and the research literature about mitigation deterrence is mixed. It's all over the map. We don't really know to what extent even conversations about solar geoengineering will facilitate and legitimize a race to deployment. We need to be careful about that and pay attention to it and hold those risks as real. But a modest amount of research on a longer term time frame, concomitant with an absolutely aggressive and accelerating commitment to mitigation is what I think we need now and where I think the committee report landed.
Ambuj, anything to add there?
Yeah, if I might, I just, a couple of sentences. I think just to pick up on what Peter was mentioning on the why now. As I mentioned, I mean, it's a really complex question with deep uncertainties, right? And so it's not that we're going to have, it's unlikely we're going to have a sufficient understanding of whether this is even a technically or socially feasible option in a few-year time frame. I think this is if we want to really understand whether whether solar geoengineering makes sense or not, as I said, both technically and socially, it's going to take us some time. And so in a sense, I mean, I think Beth is the one who said, you don't want to be doing this in a rush and in an emergency mode. You want to be able to think through the issues properly and be able to have sensible discussions about that to come to some reasoned arguments and understanding of the dimensions of this issue, rather than feel you're doing it when the house is on fire. So I think that, to me, the why now is, this is we think of this as this program as yielding useful knowledge, policy relevant useful knowledge, and that knowledge is important to have as early as possible, especially when it's going to take some time to really work through all the complexities of it. And again, I do want to just reemphasize what Peter said, both the modest nature of what we are proposing, and as cannot be mentioned or emphasized enough, that it is in the context of saying, as you engage on this, you must also accelerate mitigation and adaptation efforts.
Well, thanks, Ambush. So that modest ask comes with a $100 to $200 million price tag in the report over the next 5 years in the US context. So Peter, I wondered if you can give us some concrete sense of how that money ought to be spent. You talked about some buckets, you talked about some high-level principles. Are there things the US government in particular should do this year and next to advance what the report's talking about?
Well, to be honest, Simon, it's a really good question. In the committee, we did not break down that budget into specific amounts for particular aspects of the research. Obviously, some aspects of the science, the field campaigns associated with observational studies and so on are more expensive than others, and so they may be disproportionately funded. Clearly, the startup of a body of work across these disciplines is going to take time, so probably less spent in the next year, if it does get spent, than in, say, 5 years from now, 4 or 5 years from now. The level of specificity is something that needs to be worked out. I think obviously Congress and agencies will need to have a strong say in how to do that. I think, but the important thing is that from our point of view, from the committee's point of view, it's not a kind of pick and choose menu, right? That these need to be developed, as we've also said previously, in a transdisciplinary way. And let's be honest, some agencies and the federal government more generally are sort of better at doing some aspects of this than others. It's not clear to me, for example, that the US Global Change Research Program, which I think is a really important body for coordinating this work, has a deep bench with respect to the social science dimensions of this work. And so it's going to be important, should the federal government follow on our recommendations and fund this, that those kinds of capacities be meaningfully built. Also, in terms of the international cooperation and coordination, that may also not necessarily be today a strong suit of the federal agency process for global change research. And so that will be important to prioritize because it will take time to develop and is not currently in their wheelhouse in a really strong way. But this is going to be iterative. And my hope is that there'll be some dialogues between the committee and between the research community more broadly and federal agencies and Congress about how to go from the level of principles that were really embedded in the report to the specificity of budget priorities and mechanisms.
Thanks, Peter. I'm getting a couple of questions in the chat that I'll deliver to you in a moment. But first, let me just turn to Ambush just to pick up on that international coordination and cooperation question. You hinted at it. Peter just gave us some more context for it. What in concrete terms is needed, Ambush, again, just within the next couple of years to build up the capacity you're speaking about and to advance this need for international cooperation?
So, I think Peter used the term, the research landscape is ad hoc and fragmented. Let me add one more adjective to that. It is very skewed, right? It's very heavily dominated by, and understandably so, because the scientific capacity is much deeper in industrialized countries. But as I said, the developing countries, by definition, are going to be part of any solar geoengineering conversation. And so they must engage more deeply in understanding the kind of the scientific dimensions of this topic. and also the governance dimensions. So far, there's really kind of been a minimal engagement by researchers in these. I can certainly say that for India, but most of the developing countries. China is an outlier in a sense, but I want barely, it's kind of an emerged almost emerged economy now. So in some senses, the question of, and coming back to the question of capacity, right? I mean, what does it even mean to engage with this question? What does it mean what kind of capacity do we need to unpack the scientific dimensions of solar geoengineering and implications of solar geoengineering for developing countries? If they are to put together their own research programs, what does it mean to be able to put together the research programs? If they want to think about questions related to governance, what are the various dimensions? Who are the kinds of analysts and skills that you need to be able to thinking about all these kind of questions? There's natural science skills, there's social science, there's ethics, policy, law. I should say that I think generally, as one thinks about questions about how developing countries engage with these kind of questions in the climate domain, the reality is their engagement is relatively sparse, and to be able to engage with it better will need development of capacity. And I think this international coordination, to my mind, hopefully can spur some deeper thinking within these countries of what it would mean to start putting together their own programs, and what it might mean in order of how to coordinate best with partners and collaborators in industrialized countries, so as to be able to engage with these questions most fruitfully and effectively.
Thanks. All right, Beth, I'm going to turn to you, and these questions will also be relevant to others. I'm going to give you 3 linked governance questions. So, okay, grab a pen, pay close attention. First, do all forms of solar radiation management face the same governance hurdles? The second question, are there forms of similar types of international governance for other things from which we might learn as we're thinking about solar radiation management governance? And then the third question that came through from somebody watching today, it feels like the time frame is pretty urgent, and yet we're talking about putting constraints on the near-term research effort. So it feels like there's a mismatch between needed knowledge and the timeframes in which that knowledge is being produced. So I read this question as saying, how can we basically get on with things? How can we do research now if this is such an urgent subject matter? So Beth, do you have responses to any or all of those questions?
Sure. All forms of solar geo face governance hurdles. I think all forms of geoengineering face governance hurdles, whether it's solar or whether it's carbon removal. It's not always the same hurdle, though, and this has been something that I've been looking at in my work. Most people who look at geoengineering look at it either as solar or carbon removal. I've been looking at it from the point of view of what's based in a sovereign territory versus what's based in the commons. And the commons-based geoengineering methods face more of a governance hurdle simply because they are either in the atmosphere or the high seas. And this presents a whole other range of international governance questions. And as Ambuj was talking about international cooperation, I was thinking, you're trying to get nations on board with the research program. What do you do with a persistent objector? What do you do with a nation that says, no way, no how? Do we want to participate in this and you shouldn't be doing it either? That's another governance question we have to deal with. So all forms of this are not the same. We need to consider very carefully on a case-by-case basis what forms we use, how long they take, how expensive they are, and how efficacious they are. As for other international governance we can learn from, yes, absolutely. The project that I've been working on here at the Wilson Center this past 9 months or so has been looking at what can we learn from the last time we had a chance to govern a brand new nascent planet-changing technology. And that was in 1945 when we exploded atomic weapons. We had a new technology, we used it in a security context under a sense of urgency. It was developed under a sense of urgency. And now we had to decide, are we going to treat this like a regular security tool, or are we going to do something different with it? And in fact, in 1946, the United States proposed the Baruch Plan to the brand new United Nations to put all atomic weapons under international control. Bernard Baruch is a financier friend of Harry Truman's, and he said, I can take this and we'll sell it to the UN, and we can make sure we never use this terrible weapon again. And this idea met with all kinds of approval from people in governance, from scientists who had worked on it in the Manhattan Project. It met with a bit of resistance from the military, who wanted to keep this tool to themselves. But eventually, it fell apart in the United Nations because the United States and the Soviet Union at the time could not agree on how this would be governed. They were still relying on this paradigm of sovereignty, territorial sovereignty. And if I had to have this weapon, then you had to have it so we could balance each other. That led to the arms race. And at its worst point, we had over 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. So we missed a chance there in 1946 to put this technology under international control for the benefit of everyone. I'm proposing here that we don't miss that chance again. The report actually seemed to diss the idea of anticipatory international governance, except on an ad hoc basis. I think it said establishment of a high-level committee is neither practical nor prudent. And I thought, why? We don't just set up international governing bodies with this kind of mandate overnight. So we need to lay the groundwork for this now. We need to set up the norms of international environmental governance now. And already at this point in time, we're facing not just the degradation of the environment, we're facing the degradation of democratically based decision-making around the world. We're facing the decline of international institutions and a renewed interest in sovereignty and nationalism. So we need to make sure that when I hope this nationalist wave sort of peters itself out, that we can in fact come back to international law and governance as a way to govern a planet-changing technology.
Simon, I wonder if I can step in here. I like a lot of what you just said, Beth. I do think the report, to be fair, did highlight the need for anticipatory international governance and laid out a mechanism to try to create a process by which that could be developed. And I think that's both important and necessary, while recognizing that it's not going to be developed de novo in short order. It's going to take time and needs to be done deliberately. Yes,
but it doesn't need to. We can build off of existing structures if we need to.
Yeah,
even doing that, it still won't be done de novo, as you say. But the report said flat out, it's unlikely and perhaps imprudent that a committee, I wrote it down, charged by the UN Secretary General. And I thought, no, that's exactly who needs to set this up. That's exactly what's going to give it international legitimacy, so that when this agency says, yes, United States, you can conduct an experiment here, no, India, you cannot conduct this experiment here, it has the imprimatur of international approval.
Well, so we may differ over whether we think this could be developed in the current international framework today, what that might look like and how effective that's be, whether we'll kind of go to a least common denominator in our current politics or something that would actually be robust, but we absolutely need to be intentional about building it out, as you say. But I want to come to the question of urgency, which Simon, you also raised, if you don't mind, because I think that's actually not a helpful frame with respect to the question of how to build out a solar geoengineering, well-governed solar geoengineering research program. Urgency gets us into all kinds of trouble in the context of building things out that are not inclusive, building things out that lead to hasty decision-making, building things out that don't take seriously the need for full participation, including civil society engagement. It's going to take time to build out from where we are today in that ad hoc, fragmented, and not well represented approach we have to this research today into something that will actually be robust and lead to informed decision-making. Yes, of course, the climate challenge is serious and upon us and urgent. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think, I think we should be looking on a 15 to 20 year timeline over decisions about whether we want to ever consider deploying this or not, these technologies or not. I don't think they're going to be decisions that we should be encouraging be made soon in the next 5 to 10 years. And developing a research agenda to lead to better informed decisions is going to take some time if we're going to do it well. So let's start with the basics now. I think the Academy report did a good job of laying out what the kind of first steps for that should look like within the US context, but with an eye towards international collaboration and cooperation. Let's do it with deliberate investments and intentionality, but let's not do it with a level of overarching urgency that leads us to make decisions that won't be robust and resilient to future conditions.
Thanks, Peter. Bush, we've been talking about US domestic government action, or we've been talking about international cooperation amongst governments. There's a question here from Ruth Greenspan Bell at the Wilson Center. Has the report considered the possibility of private non-state research or deployment? How do we think about actions beyond governments?
We did discuss that, but in the end, because it's a technology that may well be potentially deployable by non-state actors, but in the end, it's again, I'm not an international law expert, but it will require some kind of an international governance arrangement to protect against that. And again, there'll be there will be certainly other examples that one could pick on. I did want to kind of add one point about this whole governance question. I think what really, and again, picking up on Beth's example of the nuclear. Actually, I didn't know about that Baruch proposal, but certainly I think the path we went
Nobody
down,
does. Nobody knows about this, but we really blew it there. It was a turning point in 20th century history, and we completely took the wrong track.
And what went out after that, I think, is how not to govern globally, where there are some people who actually have are more equal than others in what say they have over a technology. And so I think as we think about international governance arrangements, I think questions of fairness and justice and making sure that governance arrangements actually ensure that not just, we talked about making sure that the views of the marginalized and the vulnerable are represented in the research, but they must also eventually be represented in the governance. And while, and I think that also goes to your point, thinking about governance of solar geoengineering was beyond the mandate of this committee. We were thinking about research and research governance. To the extent we thought about governance of solar geoengineering, that was saying, what might the research agenda that helps us understand governance arrangements look like, and that it should be an important research agenda. And I think that is precisely the kind of things we need to be thinking about. What are the kind of governance arrangements that one could imagine that would be fair and robust and so on? I don't think anybody has an answer to that right now. I think this is a big research question, and I think this must be a major part of the research agenda. Simon, I'm actually I want to just take a second and go a little bit beyond, I think, what you asked, which is and maybe non-state actors in terms of deployment. I want to think about non-state actors in supporting better thinking about solar geoengineering. While the US government is the primary audience for this report, and as I said, I'm hoping that developing country governments will be a kind of a secondary or it'll be a co-benefit that they will start thinking about this question. I think the role that philanthropies should play here, I think, is very important. Philanthropic organizations are already playing a role in funding different kinds of work relating to solar geoengineering, whether it's governance or whether it's research. To my mind, I think these kinds of non-state actors, philanthropies especially, could play a really important role in at least some of the issues that I'm thinking about, which are questions about making sure that one is able to build capacity in developing countries in these kinds of, to engage with this kind of a topic, to make sure as we are exploring different kind of governance arrangements or those kind of issues, that there is a solid representation of analysts from across the world, and especially marginalized communities in those kind of conversations, because I think the reality is, as of now, that's not the case. And I think it is, to my mind, philanthropies actually could play a really key role here by stepping into the breach and making sure that these kind of conversations are really, there's a reasonable geographic and other kind of representation into these conversations, and the kind of capacity that's built to engage intelligently with these conversations, so that they actually lead to appropriate outcomes. Process, you cannot separate outcome from process, and therefore making sure that you have the right kind of representation of people with the right kind of capabilities is really important. And I think philanthropies can play a really important role there that complements the role that is going to be played by national governments.
Beth, anything additional on these themes?
No, that's great. I have to say, I was wondering if Bill Gates's divorce was going to affect the funding of this at all.
Could I just follow up on the philanthropy piece? Because Bill Gates is a lightning rod in this conversation, right? Sort of the elephant in the room in some regards.
You've seen the headlines that say Bill Gates blots out the sun. I mean, come on, right?
But let's talk about that, because those headlines shape public opinion. They shape perception. They therefore shape the way in which people consider whether and under what conditions this research should go forward. So they're really important to take account of. And I totally agree with Ambuj that there's an important role for philanthropy to play, particularly, I think, as you said to me, Ambuj, in one of our committee meetings, it's important to not only help build capacity for developing countries to engage in research and governance in important ways, but also for developed nations, in particular the US, to learn how to have the capacity to step back, right? And not to be the dominant force in these conversations. And that kind of capacity building is needed as well. And when you have, to just use that example, Bill Gates funding a research program at Harvard inclusive of outdoor experiments, it's sort of a mix of institutions that send a message about the dominance of first world researchers and the dominance of private philanthropy to control, in some people's minds, these technologies. Whether you agree with those perceptions or not, those perceptions become real. And there are things that private philanthropy probably should not be doing because they aren't accountable, because their actions aren't inherently transparent. And they aren't, won't be required in the moment, in the absence of really good research governance, to adhere to whatever rules we might think they should. So we're going to need private philanthropy to play a constructive, complementary role to what government should be doing, and not to be playing an outsized role that actually gets in the way of constructive public dialogue and civil discourse. And I think that's a problem today, and we need to make sure it's not going to be a problem moving forward.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, one way to read this report is as arguing for a US-led research effort. Peter, I get the sense that that's not the intent. What's the appropriate role for the US in advancing conversations about solar radiation management?
I'd actually be interested in Ambuj's response to this, and I'll weigh in and others as well.
Yeah, I think we were. It's unfortunate if it's being interpreted as a US-led international effort, because I think we were careful to not say that. I think we said that the US should, in coordination with other countries, and so I think my personal view is that yes, the US should certainly, if it engages, starts to engage on this program, the kind that we've recommended. It should reach out to other countries, and certainly these kind of bilateral arrangements happen across with many countries to suggest to developing countries that maybe they also want to build their own programs so that they can be possibilities of collaboration and working together and all of that. I think the US could play a very important role there. So I would actually say it's not a US-led program, but a US program that coordinates with others and also facilitates potentially deeper engagement with other developing countries on this, by and with other developing countries on this issue. I think to me that would be probably the most fruitful way to bring other countries into this conversation.
Well, I certainly agree with that, Ambuj. We just have to recognize the politics of it. We are in a moment in which we have an administration which is taking the other dimensions of climate policy seriously, both mitigation and adaptation, and that's really important. Of course, our Congress is still uncertain in terms of how it will act on climate, but the U.S. is in a volatile moment, as are many nations, with respect to its stability as a a nation committed to climate action.
Peter, that actually argues against a U.S.-led agency, though, or a U.S.-led institution, because if the Republicans take the House and Senate back in 2022, this whole thing comes to a screeching halt.
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go.
At that point, sorry.
I totally agree. I'm sorry, it took a while to get there, but I totally agree with you. We need to be really careful not to set up a process that works on the assumption, which is not a well-grounded assumption, that the politics of today will be the politics of even 2 years from now. And so not having it be US led as opposed to US in a collaborative role, and with having, as we didn't really talk about, but important to name, kind of exit ramps to the research so that it can, we can find ways both as civil society actors and government actors to constrain work if it heads off in directions inconsistent with the goals and principles of international cooperation. We need to take those really seriously into account in the design, because we can't assume that the politics of today will be sustained going forward.
Beth, can I give you another couple of questions? So one comes from Martha Schwartz at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. It concerns an operationalization of what Ambuj has been speaking about. Basically, how does the Global North ensure that more people of the Global South are included in the discussion? Beth, if you could pick up on that question, then I'll turn back to Ambuj for further thoughts. And the second question, Beth, just to put it on the table for you, the question has popped up again. What about private sector deployment? Have you been thinking about ways to guard against private sector actions? Sorry, that's the wrong framing. Maybe to facilitate productive private sector action.
Okay, I'll start with the second one. Private sector deployment. From what I've been reading and hearing, I don't think that there's any private sector that is going to be able to do this unilaterally. If they did it at all, they would be doing it in conjunction with the government or in conjunction with private sectors of other countries, which raises the interesting possibility that this entire enterprise might be taken out of government control and privatized completely. So that is, I think, that's something that could be designed into the way any kind of governance regime is built, but I don't have a particular plan as to how to get there at this point in time. With regard to the first question about how does the Global North ensure cooperation of the Global South or ensure participation of the Global South? That was from Martha. This is going to be a little bit trickier, and I think it's going to require the Global North, particularly the United States, to eat some humble pie, because we've been, for the past couple decades, a bad actor when it comes to global environmental regimes. We have said, no, we don't think climate change is real, this is a hoax, and we've gone out to increase our carbon emissions as though this whole thing were in fact a hoax. And so I think now for us to say, hey, we have this new potential technological regime that could help us ameliorate this problem, y'all come on board, is gonna be, they're gonna look at us with suspicion, as they should. We need to come out and say, okay, we're taking mitigation seriously. We've all said throughout this entire presentation, we can't give up on mitigation, we can't give up on carbon removal. SRM works in conjunction with those. But if we just say, hey, we have a solar geo regime, we'd like to invite you guys to collaborate with us, they're gonna say, why don't you go first? Since you created the problem, you go first in fixing it and we'll join you later. So I think there's a lot of the ethics and policy that we've been talking about for this entire hour is gonna play directly into how the Global South is going to see the veracity of our intentions. And I'll let Ambuj talk a little bit more about that.
All right, so let me actually, I think, say a couple of different things here. And I think it picks up on maybe the conversation Peter and I were having during the committee discussions. You know, I'd written a paper many years ago thinking about equity in the climate space. And I kind of more or less ended the paper by talking, it was about capacity, as you might imagine. And I ended the paper more or less by saying that, you know, if you want a kind of a fair and just outcome, you need both the capacity to speak and the capacity to listen, right? And so I think certainly at the very least, I would say that, you know, maybe this notion of the fact that different groups may have different perspectives and those are all valuable and worth listening to, rather than you know, just dominating. And it's not with any bad intentions, but it's just to recognize that actually that the people who may have less capacity to speak, maybe you have to listen more carefully to them. But I would actually, you know, say, who is the global north? I mean, why do we think of the global north as a monolith? I mean, let me put a kind of a slightly provocative example here. If one is to think about global north as individuals and individual scientists, maybe one can actually say that as scientists, for example, and I again want to bring philanthropies because philanthropies have much more flexibility than governments in who they fund, right? With governments, it becomes very difficult to fund researchers outside your own country. But maybe I would say that as, for example, researchers from the north who are approaching philanthropy for funding for research on this question, maybe they should say, for every dollar that we ask for themselves, we're going to ask philanthropy to give $1 to Southern researchers. So in other words, change can begin at home, so to speak, right? So if we don't think about global north as this monolith, but actually break it down and say, okay, what can individuals do in the global north to promote participation of the global south? I think we could probably come up with some fairly interesting and productive ways to do it.
Anything further there, Peter?
No, not specifically at this point, Simon. Thank you.
Okay. We have 5 or so minutes left for conversation and remarks. The final question that I want to pose to you before I turn back to the chat and see if there's anything else. Environmental justice is at the heart of the Biden administration's new climate push. I wonder about conversations inside the committee. Are there forms of solar radiation management research which are compatible with precepts of environmental justice? How was that present in the committee's thinking, Peter?
Well, it was sort of a central thread to the committee's discussions throughout the 2 years of putting together the report, and we wrestled with this a lot, as I hope is reflected in the content and framings and all the dimensions around diversity, equity, inclusion that are represented in the report's recommendations. Look, I don't think we are at a place where we can say confidently that we know how to do build out a solar geoengineering research program in a way that is entirely consistent with the precepts of environmental justice. We're working at this, right? We are at the front end of trying to figure this out, as we are with, to be honest, with respect to many areas of research, including but not limited to in the climate change domain. This is something that institutions are wrestling with, and I don't think we have a well-defined, well-honed, deeply grounded pathway to do so. What we have is really strong intent, kind of key principles that we think are appropriate to follow, and a need to learn as we go, iteratively. So there are many ways in which we can trip over in the building out of a solar geoengineering research program and live into approaches that are clearly not consistent with inclusive, equitable participation in decision-making over both the design of research and its representation. So there are a lot of ways to do this badly. And I think we need to be intentional about paying attention to those, making sure that we're not simply following the pathways that we have in the past in ways that are frankly consistent with a relatively small number of researchers and a small number of decision makers taking action with implications for a much larger community, both in the US and in this context in particular globally. So do we know how to do it, or do we know exactly where the fault lines are? No, I don't think we do. But I think we really need to kind of live into the goals and see how we kind of learn by doing as we go forward.
And if I might just come in for a second here, Simon, I think it also relates to the question that I think was posed about, I think I don't forget the exact phraseology, but something along the lines of, let's just get on with this research and let's not put hurdles in the way. I think the question is how to do this research in ways that are sensitive to the various kinds of concerns, justice being a very important one. And I think that's the tricky one. So I think I worry about saying, let's really move really fast, because in the end, I think we need to move with deliberate speed. We need to move carefully and cautiously, making sure, as we do that, we try to think about questions, these ethical questions, these questions about participation and all of that, that are important for multiple reasons, but and make sure that those are part of the research implementation, but also part of the research agenda itself. And I think it's only if we do that kind of deliberate approach, making sure we are paying adequate attention to these kind of questions as we design the research program, as we make it part of the research program. I think it's only then that we will be able to do justice to questions like environmental justice.
Ambush, keep the floor. We're coming to the final few minutes, so let me give you just no more than a minute each for final thoughts. What should we be taking away from the conversation today, Ambush?
To my mind, I think what we need to be taking away from the conversation is that on this question of solar geoengineering research, I think it's important we do this because there are people who are saying that we should not even do solar geoengineering research because of the slippery slope. And to me, actually, I think the message is no, we should do the research. It's an important question, and we cannot ignore the fact that more information is needed in order to think better about this question. But as we do the research, and again, I'm just re-emphasizing the point I just made, but as we are doing this research, we must proceed carefully and thoughtfully and a deliberate fashion. And I think that's important. And also to take away the message that I think Peter said, that the kinds of things we're talking about, part of our research agenda really is a package. It's not, it's not pick up pieces. And I think that's why we actually use the term equitable treatment of all the research topics. It is not a pick and choose. It is to say the funding must be equitably allocated to them, and you must make sure that all those are addressed, because that's the way to, in a sense, to move forward on the research agenda in the way that I think is going to be both productive but also careful. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambush. Peter, no more than a minute, and then I'll give Beth the final word.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So, we're at a moment where solar geoengineering as a topic is not really very much in the public mind, right? There isn't a lot of discussion about this. People don't really understand what this topic is, and that provides both an opportunity to have an evidence-based, inclusive dialogue around an issue in principle, without it kind of being caught up in a highly polarized context. Of course, and this conversation is an example of that, and I'm grateful to the Wilson Center for creating this conversation as a kind of model for how to have those dialogues. We need more of them. It's really tricky as we think about the build out of funding for this work and governance of this work in the particular highly polarized kind of moment that we're in, to do so in a way that enables us to really bring evidence to the fore and to allow a range of possible outcomes, including rejection of this technology, if that's where society lands, as real possibilities and not get locked into one approach. It's really tricky to figure out how to do that because this isn't going to be in the absence of public opinion, as we're already seeing in the various media reports that have, in some ways, selectively represented the issue or the results of the committee. So I don't know what the magic elixir is to that. I think this is a good example of how to do that. But it's my goal, and I think it should be everybody's goal, to figure out ways to really draw upon the committee's recommendations and the nature of a evidence-based conversation and figure out whether we can avoid this getting into the trap of polarized partisan dialogue, but really think about how to do it in an inclusive and deliberate and evidence-based way.
Thank you, Peter. Final thoughts, Beth, no more than a minute?
Yes, that was an excellent point that Peter concluded with about not letting this fall into the trap of partisanship. I remain hopeful about Glasgow. I remain hopeful about the US climate agenda, and that it will eventually progress to where it needs to be. Maybe that's a foolish hope, I don't know, but I have it anyway. What interests me about this whole problem, and I think the report is leading to this isn't going to be the last report. There'll be further reports. There'll be research done. There'll be the conclusions of the research. There'll be people weighing in on the research. All of this is necessary. And we can't lose sight of the fact that these are planet-changing technologies that we're talking about here. If they weren't planet-changing, then they're not working. So we need to be humble when we're considering changing the climate of the planet on purpose. And we need to remember that all of these sovereign states that will be dealing with this once it's gone past the research stage, if it goes past the research stage to the deployment stage, is that as much as they claim to be sovereign and they will take their sovereign interests into account, there's no such thing as ecological sovereignty. And we have to remember that as we're putting together some sort of international regime to change our planet.
Beth, Peter, Ambush, thank you. Fascinating conversation. I wish we could continue it. We can't. We're calling a halt now. Thank you to the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center for sponsoring the event, along with the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Wilson Center. The Union of Concerned Scientists and Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment were co-sponsors. A recording of today's event will be available at the Wilson Center event page in the next day or two, so watch out for that and share it. And finally, a summary of today's event will be available on the Wilson Center blog, New Security Beat, in the coming weeks. Thank you all for tuning in.
And thank you, Simon, for being an awesome moderator.
Yes, thank you.
Pleasure, Beth. Thank you, Ambush. Thank you, Peter.